This is just a 6-minute film. Who is that woman who cries, soothing her hungry children? जाने वाले सिपाही से पूछो वो कहाँ जा रहा है. I feel very privileged to be here, and to be honest, I prepared my talk before I came here, and I think I've changed my mind about how I'm going to be putting some of these ideas across after I came here and having met a lot of people. I think this is more about a conversation with people who know what social movements are about. And so it's not a formal lecture in that sense. What I'll try to do today is to speak a little bit about why I decided to do this, and not so much to draw attention to myself, but to be able to share with you all the reasons why I thought the music of protest is something that needs to be thought about much more deeply than one normally thinks about it. And at least it was that way in the Indian context, definitely. And while I don't know very much about Sri Lankan musical traditions, of course, I have been hearing a lot of music over the years, and I've also read up a little bit about what debates have taken place here around music that reflects societal trends, but I'm a complete novice when it comes to the traditions from Sri Lanka. But I'm hoping that some of the things that I have to say might find some kind of resonance with some of the debates here, or the trends that have been there here. So I want to start by saying why I started doing this. Now, I've been a cultural activist ever since I was 14 or 15 years old, and in Delhi, and I used to perform with a group called Parcham. Parcham is a song squad. It exists in some form even now, and we used to perform in street corners, factory gates, wherever we were asked to perform. We also did some formal kind of proscenium based performances. We worked with theatre people, and we were a song squad, but there was also a street theatre group, which then became very well known because the founder of that theatre group, the group called Jannatyam Manch, was assassinated in 1989, Safdar Hashmi, and suddenly, the idea of street theatre came to be discussed globally as it originated. The kind of street theatre that happened in India came to be discussed globally, and Safdar's assassination also provoked a huge amount of outcry and so on. So that is the broad context in which we used to perform in Delhi, in large parts of North India, a little bit in other parts of India as well. So one of the kind of traditions that we heard about, and we used to sing a lot of songs from that tradition, was something known as the IPTA, the Indian People's Theatre Association, that Kumar was talking about. And it was an organization that was set up in 1943, in the last few years of colonial rule, where it reflected the desire by artists to respond to the times through their art. And we used to sing a lot of IPTA songs. But the songs that we used to sing were more or less stereotypical protest songs. Now, what do I mean by stereotypical protest songs? They had a certain kind of grammar. And as a teenager, when I was sort of learning from people who were senior from me, there was this kind of stereotype of the protest song that was being handed down, which is that it had to sound agitational, it had to have a certain kind of a collective quality to it, it had to be something that anyone could sing, and so on. So the songs that we heard from the IPTA also were quite following the stereotype in a certain sense. So what used to happen is that, and this is, and I myself have trained in classical music ever since I was a child, and encountered a lot of musicians who considered themselves serious musicians, and musicians would never take this music seriously because it was something that was considered something that came out of movements, and it's fine for a movement, but it's not really music. That's a response that I always heard. And when it came to people who were part of the movements, for them, protest music meant it had to sound in a particular way. So if it was something that didn't fit the stereotype, it wasn't quite protest music. It needed to have, certain kinds of phrases in it. It needed to have a certain kind of tune, and so on and so forth. So there was this peculiar binary that was there, which I was beginning to, get interested in. And there was a particular song, and that song I'll sing for you at some point, which actually really changed my outlook. And that was a song that was written by an Urdu poet from Hyderabad called Makhdoom Mohyuddin at the time of the Second World War. And this song he wrote it spontaneously when he witnessed a bunch of poor, emaciated peasants who were being rounded up and conscripted to join the British Army. And he wrote this song spontaneously. It says, "Jaane wale sipahi se poocho, wo kahan ja raha hai." Ask the departing soldier where he is going. So now that's a song that completely defied the stereotype that I was talking about. And it was a song that was really appealing to the emotions. It was a song that is a solo song, not sung by a group. It's more amenable to solo singing, and it's a song that can make people cry. And this is a song that was taught to me by Safdar Hashmi, who later on was assassinated. And it was a song that we developed in Parcham as a solo song being sung by me, along with the chorus. And so that song itself was very different from the protest songs that we were generally singing. And there was one experience with singing that song that really changed things for me, which was that 1984, after Mrs. Gandhi was assassinated, and the connection to Sri Lanka is obvious over there. She was assassinated by her security guard, who was from the Sikh community. Later on, of course, her son was assassinated as well. What happened was that there was a carnage against people of the Sikh community, and it turned into a communal kind of a carnage. So it was as if people of the community were responsible for her assassination, and therefore it had to be avenged. So all of Delhi and many parts of North India were burning. There was curfew, and men from the Sikh community, and when I say men, including newborn little boys, were being literally snatched away from their mother's arms and set on fire, murdered, and so on. Now, it was politically motivated, and that was one of the early instances in which a citizens' committee was formed in Delhi to appeal for calm and to point out that this was politically motivated and this is not really about the community. So there was a peace march that was organized. Several peace marches were organized at that time. The citizens' committee was formed of people from political backgrounds, but also a lot of academics, artists, lawyers, and so on. And this big march was going to go through Delhi University, which is a very large university with lots of colleges, and trying to campaign in the colleges to basically tell people that, look, this should not translate into hatred for the Sikh community. This is actually just politics, and the way to deal with it is to expose the politics. So the march went through different colleges, spoke to students in the hostels, and there was a lot of it was a very tense moment, and it was supposed to end at a college which was owned by the religious establishment of the Sikh communities. That was the only place where Sikh the Sikh community felt safe. So this march was supposed to end over there, and which it did. And when we went there, but by then the violence had been so widespread and so many people had lost their lives that the people from the community wanted to take revenge. So at that moment, there was a lot of anger among Sikh youth who just wanted to go out and avenge the deaths of their fathers and brothers and so on. And this committee was trying to hold a public meeting and appeal for calm and say that this will just end in civil war and it's not going to solve any problems. But there was no way in which the crowd was calming down. And at that point, somebody said to me, Safdar Hashmi in fact said to me, I was very young then, and can you sing that song? And I was brash, young, and I turned around and I said, but this is a song that has been written about the Second World War. And, so he said, please don't argue with me right now. Can you sing it? And then we'll talk about it later. And we sang it. And that was the first instance in which that song was sung. And it, sometimes I wonder whether I was exaggerating the effect of it, and because it was a personal thing, but those who were there at that time remember this. And it completely transformed the atmosphere. I know people were, fell to the ground in tears. And finally, the message did go across that, we need to have a conversation beyond, avenging violence with more violence. So this was an experience that transformed things for me completely. But more importantly, the question that came to my mind was that if there was a song like this from the 40s that was forgotten, surely there must have been more. So if we remember only a certain kind of song as the protest song, there must be a reason for it. And what happened to all those songs? So much, much later, in about 2006 or so, I decided to actually look, start doing some research into what kind of music came out of the social movements of the 1940s and 50s. So, and surprisingly, I found that nobody had done it. And it was really at the end of the lives of a lot of the artists of that time. I was fortunate to actually have met some of the great artists of the time who were by then in their late 70s, 80s. Most of them have passed away after that. But I was able to meet them and capture the dynamic of that particular time. And so that's the background in which I took up this work on the music of the IPTA. But as I started doing more research, and I started actually looking at debates not only within India and internationally as well, I came across the dimensions of this big movement that took place in the arts from the 1930s onwards. And by the 40s and 50s, it had gained a lot of momentum. And that is what I have called the radical impulse in my book. That it was a certain kind of an impulse that was spontaneously spreading throughout the world. And a lot of conversations were happening between artists who were responding to social movements of different kinds, which reflected a lot of very interesting sociological facts. So I can talk about this for hours on end. What I'll try to do is to present some of the salient features of what I found. So that was that period that of the 40s and 50s that I'm talking about. But subsequently, I have also tried to use the idea of the radical impulse to look at the relationship between art and social movements later on also. So what I'm going to be talking about is primarily the Indian case, a little bit, and when I say Indian, because we're talking about it beginning from the 30s onwards, it obviously includes Pakistan and Bangladesh as well. And what I'll try to do is to actually not only talk about that period, but also what's happened subsequently into the present. Because in the last 10 years or so, there's been a new upsurge in India. And in fact, in Pakistan and Bangladesh as well, there's been a renewal of the idea of music being used to articulate protest, and musicians thinking through many of these ideas very carefully. So I've called this people's music because that was a term that was coined in the early part of the 20th century to talk about a radical imaginary through music. From its second decade, the 20th century saw the need for a people's art, a need to represent, unearth, popularize, and express through forms that emerged from and belonged to the people. So, and if one actually looks at the debates, this question of the people is really varied and offers a very interesting lens for us to look into a whole range of political questions. So a whole plethora of ideas and experiments on what people's music is, should be, and can be emerged in different parts of the world, fueled by the need to craft an alternative aesthetic. This radical impulse in art was fueled by the events of the historical conjuncture of the first half of the 20th century and the varied iconography that emerged from the early years of that century to represent the people in art and literature. And if one actually looks at history from the late 19th century onwards, you actually see that this has been a big fight with the establishment in many parts of the world to establish the legitimacy of the ordinary person as a subject of history and of art. And, you know, there have been huge debates with the establishment in different parts of the world, and that's something that really unites a radical imaginary all over the world. Nationalist movements in Latin America, Asia and Africa, the pre- and post-revolution political movements in China and Russia, the Greek resistance, May 1968, the civil rights movement, popular frontism, the anti-apartheid movement, and the Nueva Canción movement in Latin America are some examples of massive political upheavals that created repertoires of political music over the course of the 20th century. Over the entire 20th century and into the present, expansive and varied notions of who the people or the popular classes, as Antonio Gramsci was to refer to them, were employed in the creation of protest music. Varied iconographies emerged from the ideologies that constituted the left-wing politics of the time, notably nationalism, anti-fascism, and an emancipatory socialism, and were expressed musically in different ways. Music, like other art forms, came to be employed in establishing the ordinary person as a legitimate subject of history and art, resulting in a varied musical iconography of the people. Now, if one actually looks at it, the debates were very different in different parts of the world. Who are the people? And, you know, how do you define the nation? So if one actually goes back to the roots of some of these nationalist debates, you can see really a difference between what I've called the nationalism from above and the nationalism from below. And this difference really is in terms of who the people are. So to what extent do you include and to what extent do you exclude in terms of defining a nationalist project. In India, from the 1930s, or the beginning of a transitionary period from colonialism to independence, there was the cultural expression of a very wide range of political sentiments and positions concerning imperialism, fascism, nationalism, and social transformation. The Indian People's Theatre Association, a cultural organization aligned with the left political movement, was set up in 1943. This people's art and theatre attempted to reflect and respond to the travails of a colonized nations, as well as to the specifics of the multi-layered oppression of the common people in the colonial and immediate post-colonial context. Now, across the country, some of the best artists of the time were involved with the IPTA. In fact, a lot of the people who later on did not want to associate themselves from the IPTA as well, at that point, if you were not right-wing completely, you were part of the IPTA. So some of the, and therefore the IPTA had a huge imprint in terms of the popular imaginary. Later on, in terms of popular literature, cinema, Bollywood, regional cinema, all these actually bore the imprint of what the IPTA artists were doing. Now, what were they trying to do? A significant part of the protest music repertoire in the 30s and 40s consisted of music that was excavated, retrieved from, and played back to the people. So one of the dimensions was what the sociologist Michael Denning has called the documentary aesthetic. That if there is the music of the people, which has been marginalized for various reasons, one role of the musician was to document, unearth, and to play back to the people. In fact, Chinese musician called Guo Moro at that point called it being a phonograph. So this was a very major thing that happened all over the world. And if you look at the experiences of several countries, you actually find people really going out into the countryside and collecting music. And in the process of collecting music, actually coming to have a clear idea of who the people are. So there's a big repertoire, therefore, that is available. In many countries it's been documented, in many countries it hasn't been. I tried to do some of that for India, whatever was available. In producing people's music under the IPTA tradition, a crucial question that came up was the degree of engagement with tradition. Now, this is something that has continued to haunt India ever since. What do we mean by tradition? What do we mean by our tradition? And what do we mean by what is not our tradition? And musicians are, not just musicians, artists and people who are not artists as well are also constantly engaged in big contestations around this idea of tradition. Within a political understanding that colonialism had destroyed and marginalized the cultures of the people, one of the tasks of musical representation, it was felt, was to bring back into the public sphere traditional music on behalf of the people. So a big question was, what do we do with the classical traditions? Are the classical traditions elitist, or do classical traditions belong to the people? So that was a very major debate. And in the Soviet Union, soon after the revolution, again, this was a very major debate. And one of the things that did happen was that while classical music might have been imbued with the imperial courts and the power that is contained within that, music itself is not imperial, and music can be taken to the masses. So this whole thing of popularizing classical music in the Soviet Union happens as a result of a lot of these kinds of debates. In India, classical musician Ravi Shankar, whose name all of you would have heard, and many others produced protest music that was strongly based in the Indian classical music tradition. And they also took the position that music intended for a political cause should not compromise on complexity and rigor in its effort to be accessible to large numbers of people. So Ravi Shankar was very clear about this, that music has to reflect whatever rigor it comes from. You don't need to talk about people's music as if it is something that needs to be very simple. That is actually infantilizing your notion of the people. Okay, so developing classical traditions in the service of the people was something that was one of the major things that the IPTA did. Interestingly, the IPTA actually organized itself in the form of communes in the early days. So the artists and the poets and they had these communes where they used to actually produce various artistic productions and then go out and perform. So it was part of a social experiment, really, of also living differently in order to produce people's music. Now, I was actually reading up some of the material on Sri Lanka, and I'm very interested actually in some of the debates that happened around what the true music of Sri Lanka is, in terms of the nationalism debates about whether it is music that comes from the North Indian, influenced by the North Indian tradition, or whether there is something which is purely, Sinhala and so on and so forth. I've been quite fascinated to read some of those debates, but I'm not the authority at all. But when I was reading it, it brought to mind some of these very interesting debates that have taken place about the role of tradition in India. Now, the repertoire in the 40s and 50s also consisted of songs which were drawing upon folk traditions. As I said, this question of the classical versus the folk, or the relationship between the classical and the folk, is something that came up for a lot of discussion. And increasingly, it was argued that while classical music might have become part of a citadel, in terms of caste structures or class structures, classical music traditions actually came from the people historically. And now there is a lot of social history material which actually has demonstrated that the histories of classical music are actually people's music. So there need not be a binary between what is called classical music and folk music. A lot of the classical traditions actually have folk roots. So working with folk traditions was also a very major question. Now, if one actually looks at some of the debates that happened in the US from the 1910s onwards, it's very vibrant about the relationship, what to do with the classical tradition, what the notion of folk is, who the folk of the United States are, and so on. So one can draw these very interesting parallels about and it would almost seem as if they were speaking with each other. I think they were. People were meeting also in some of the conferences that were being held by the Anti-Fascist Front and so on. So word would go around, but a lot of it was also responding to the times at that time. So the folk music tradition was obviously that's not something that went into contestation about whether it belongs to the people or not. And that was something that was worked through in very, very interesting ways in different parts of the country, by different kinds of musicians in very different ways. Again, there's a huge repertoire over there, and if anyone's interested, I could talk about it more later. There were also songs which were based on Western musical traditions. Now, one of the interesting questions that came up was, again, in the heydays or at the height of the anti-colonial movement, what is the relationship to the Western tradition? Do we talk about an Indian tradition which is not the Western tradition? And there have been very interesting debates around music about what is truly Indian music. I mean, Partha Chatterjee and others have written so much about nationalism and how it distinguishes itself from European traditions in particular kinds of ways. But artists of the IPTA were working very interestingly with Western traditions as well. Politically, a lot of this music came out of a deep internationalism and an alignment of nationalist and socialist sentiments with international movements against fascism, for civil rights, and for socialism. So there were musicians in India who were very taken in by the American protest song movement. Paul Robeson played a very major role in influencing a lot of musicians in India. Of course, the Soviet tradition, what came from European socialist traditions and so on, were also, and a lot of the socialist anthems and all of that were translated into Indian languages and sung. But what was perhaps most interesting was that Indian musicians started working with the Western idiom very interestingly. And again, later on, these caused some serious disagreements. So for example, when the All India Radio, the All India Radio which existed before independence, but after independence, the All India Radio decided to ban the harmonium because the harmonium has come out of the piano kind of a tradition, and the idea was that the harmonium can't really play Indian notes. And that ban lasted for a long time. So there was that counter which came from the Indian side which said, no, this is not our Indian music. But a lot of Indian musicians actually wrote substantially saying the harmonium has become an Indian instrument. And so these are very interesting ways in which actually if you go into the real technical details of music, how the relationship between music and politics plays out in different periods. Now, from the 1950s, the IPTA's aesthetic was incorporated into popular cinema in different ways, with music playing a very important role. Working with colloquial usages in languages and folk tunes that stemmed from the lives of ordinary people. A lot of films came out which inaugurated the period of socially relevant yet commercial cinema. And in many of these, the ordinary person was the critical protagonist in a newly independent nation that had achieved the desired transition from colonialism, but which was fast emerging on the radical agenda of independence. So now the interesting thing is, soon after independence, I mean within a decade or so, the Indian state started banning a lot of the IPTA music because it was asking too many questions. Again, this is something that one sees in different parts of the world, where something that is part of a radical movement, the moment that so-called objective is achieved, suddenly becomes problematic. So in India as well, a lot of the musicians, the artists of the IPTA, many of them were arrested after independence, and what were called the Dramatic Performances Act and so on, which were about high levels of censorship and critiques of the way in which these artists were actually portraying what was happening in the newly independent nation, resulted in quite significant repression. So, in a nutshell, this is about the music of the IPTA in that period. Now, I mean, in my assessment, there was quite a hiatus from the 60s onwards. So the massive repertoires of music and the range is absolutely astounding in terms of the styles, the experiments, the debates. Yeah, the other thing I want to mention over here is that what I have realized is the relationship between music and social movements in countries which have strong oral traditions happens through oral means or oral means. So many of the debates that were happening between musicians were not actually written about. So if you have to try and find out what was actually happening in the mind of a musician in response to some theoretical idea around the relationship between music and politics, it was happening in terms of musical responses. And that is something that is extremely interesting in the non-West. And so when we listen to that music, so music itself, the song itself, or the composition itself becomes a very interesting text from which we can read a lot of these debates. So as a social scientist, for me, that was something that was absolutely fascinating. And as a musician myself, that, that how can I listen to a song and listen to another song and actually recognize the debate? And as method, this is something that I found extremely fascinating. And I've also cross-checked that with the people who were engaging in that debate, and they said that was true. So if there was something that was coming up for debate, and there was a disagreement about a particular kind of a song, another musician would just compose another song, and that was the debate. So that becomes a very, very fertile ground for us to understand the relationship between aesthetics and politics, where it's not actually written down so well. Yeah, okay. What I want to do now is to just show a short film. Now, this is a film which came, because I'm going to now switch to the later period. This is a film that came out of an exhibition, a sound installation that I curated in 2017 for a festival in Goa, and they asked me to, convert my research into visual form, and I didn't really know how to do it, so I collaborated with an animation filmmaker and a designer, and tried to look at about 80 years of protest music, symbolically through some of the art that came out in the period, and also responding to the times about what was happening in India at that particular point of time. So around 2015, 2016, there was a series of lynchings that happened, where people from the Muslim community were killed and actually hung up on trees because they were suspected to be cattle traders or, supplying beef and so on. So that was a series of lynchings which brought to mind the early 20th century lynchings of black people in the United States, and the song that was written, "Strange Fruit," was in response to those lynching. So what I've tried to do, this is just a 6-minute film, which will give you a sense, is to use some of these images to actually talk about a little bit of the history of the Indian subcontinent through the way in which musicians and artists have looked through it.
अपना हो या पराया हो, नस्ल आदम का खून है आखिर। खून अपना हो या पराया हो, नस्ल आदम का खून है आखिर। जंग मशरिक में हो के मगरिब में, जंग मशरिक में हो के मगरिब में, अमने आलम का खून है आखिर।
कौन दुखिया है जो गा रही है, भूखे बच्चों को बहला रही है। लाश जलने की बू आ रही है, जिंदगी है कि चिल्ला रही है। हमार भाई राम तेरा मानो, एक दूसरे फेब्रुआरी, आमी की भूली के बारी, ছেলে হারা শত মায়ের অশ্রু গড়ায় ফেব্রুয়ারি। ভূকা है बंगाल, पूरब देश में डूबी बागी फैला सुख का काल। सुख की अग्नि कौन बुझाए, सूख गए सब तार। जिन हाथों ने होती रोले, आज वही कंगाल मुसाफिर, आज वही कंगाल। भूखा है बंगाल, भूखा है बंगाल। गिर रहा है सियाही का डेरा, हो रहा है मेरी जान सवेरा। ऐ वतन छोड़ कर से पूछो वो कहाँ जा रहा है। जाने वाले सिपाही से पूछो वो कहाँ जा रहा है।
Yeah, you might not have understood the language, and unfortunately, there are no subtitles to this. But this was just a way of, paying tribute to that tradition. And so, a lot of the images that you've seen here, the imagery actually came from the styles of the artists in the 40s, and some of them became some of India's best known artists at that time. And so the way in which they used to paint and create the images, we tried to actually work through those styles in creating this. The anxieties with the post-independence political and developmental trajectory were to consolidate by the late 1960s, and theatre and music would start to strongly reflect the specific problems that were being experienced by the people in different parts of the country. By the time a state of internal emergency was declared in 1975, there was already a growing momentum to political music forms that were being developed. The nation and its constituents, state repression, regional assertion, economic disparities, caste and religious discrimination, communal tensions, and numerous other political concerns were to be articulated and communicated by various kinds of musicians from the mid-70s onwards. An important figure representing oppositional music was that of the bard or the balladeer, carrying forth forms that had been experimented with from older traditional bardic forms from India and from the days of the Ipta. Now, two of these people who come from this bardic tradition, one of them was called Gummadi Venkata Rao or Gadar, who came to be, again, very well known all over South Asia, and Sambhaji Bhagat, who calls himself a Marxist Ambedkarite musician from Maharashtra, emerged as prominent balladeers who created vast repertoires of songs on contemporary issues from the 1980s onwards, drawing on long-standing bardic traditions from both regions. Gadar, born in a Dalit family from Telangana, worked with the Burakatha, a traditional Telugu storytelling form, and developed it to talk about class and caste exploitation. And from the mid-1980s, Gadar worked actively with the Naxalite movement, forming the Jananatya Mandali, the cultural wing of the People's War Group, going underground and travelling extensively through forest areas in Telangana in the then Andhra Pradesh. Gadar passed away a couple of years ago. Narrating the difficulties due to galloping prices during the emergency, Gadar sang about how ordinary people found it difficult to eat in a song which translates into "There is no option." This village belongs to us, these streets belong to us, all work is because of us, all implements due to us, the plough is ours, the sickle is ours, the bullock is ours, the bullock cart is ours. Who is this oppressor and how can we call out his crime? This is the translation of one of his very popular songs. Another example, as I said, is from Maharashtra, what came to be known as the Lok Shahir tradition or the people's poetry tradition. The Shahirs were medieval poet-singers who travelled across the Marathi-speaking regions singing ballads called poadas. They converted songs which were talking about heroism and about kings and so on into a people's form which came to be known as the Lok Shahir tradition. And there were artists, singers like Amar Sheikh, Annabhav Sathe, D.N. Gavankar, who explicitly brought the idea of the people or Lok into the Shahiri tradition. They were mostly from the Mahar and Mang communities. They lent their voices to the independence movements, allied with the communists in movements for social transformation, and later on also allied with the movements for linguistic rights. So Sambhaji Bhagat, who is a contemporary Lok Shahir and who has also mentored a whole range of musicians, in fact, many of whom have gone to jail. Sambhaji himself has gone to jail several times, is an extremely powerful singer. Now the style that both Gadar and Sambhaji Bhagat have are very interactive, and it's a style that has also been very often employed by street theatre artists, where the communication with the audience is instant. I don't have the time, otherwise I would have played some of that music for you. But this is one very important kind of a tradition which has become very popular from the 1970s onwards, and they are very popular musicians today. Another set of people who are actually making a very powerful intervention are those who have been looking at how to interpret long-standing classical traditions. As I mentioned earlier, the engagement with classical traditions was one of the major things that the IPTA was interested in. Now, in 1992, with the demolition of the Babri Masjid, which then, created the whole torrential sets of events which have lasted to this day, in response to the demolition of the Babri Masjid, a number of musicians and other artists began to undertake an inquiry into what kinds of music would be able to address the questions that the political situation in the country had thrown up. At the heart of the communal situation were issues of tradition, heritage, nationalism, religion, tolerance, and citizenship. In North India, and especially in the city of Delhi, these questions had simmered for a long time, and violent politics had seen the carnage, anti-Sikh carnage of 1984, the assassination of Sardar Hashmi in 1989, between 1994 and 2002, a huge number of religious conflagrations flared up, and Hindu-Muslim riots took place in many parts of the country, and one of the biggest carnages that took place against the Muslim community was in 2002 in Gujarat. So from the 1990s onwards, these questions of heritage, tolerance and rebellion led musicians to begin studying and performing repertoires that were excavated from the past, often from traditions from centuries before. So examples that come to mind are musicians Shubha Mudgal, Madan Gopal Singh. There is something called the Kabir Project, to name a few among many, who have excavated and worked through various repertoires with a critical view. And they've also tried to work with less known older traditions, often from the 12th or 13th century. Underlying such excavations into the past were urgent questions. What did Indian history have to offer that would enable the cultural interrogation or interpretation of the present? More specifically, what did older poetic and musical traditions have to offer that could enable making sense of the present, or often offer an alternative to the predilections of the present? What in centuries old poetic and musical repertoires could be tapped to tease out secular principles or critiques of the caste system in order to make appeals for humanism and peace in the present? Again, to quote the sociologist Michael Denning, what were the elements of the usable past that could address the questions in the present? Now, this is also something that is a new project that I'm working on, where I'm trying to actually document some of these traditions and the questions that are being asked by these musicians. Now, this alternative musical imaginary, even though it is small, in comparison to what more conservative or mainstream musical trends have impacted the popular realm or the public sphere through various kinds of media, performance venues and festivals. So one of the traditions that has actually been excavated and really worked with is the Sufi tradition. And thanks to the work of some of these musicians that I'm talking about, it is fashionable to be Sufi. Sufi punk, Sufi rock, Sufi pop, and so on, to the extent that even the state machinery uses the term Sufi to talk about highly divisive music. So it is something that has become extremely popular, and therefore something that provokes censorship and the title of being called anti-national. So for example, the kind of things that this kind of music challenges is presenting the possibility that the singing of bhakti as in devotional or Sufi music, which are ostensibly religious forms, might not be necessarily related to a belief in God or otherwise. And there are musicians who sing bhakti and who sing Sufi forms who call themselves atheists, but who sing from within the tradition and with as much of an adherence to the aesthetics of bhakti as somebody who's extremely devoted. So you can imagine how problematic this could be, among religious fundamentalists. But these musicians have really gone out there and challenged things quite frontally. How am I doing for time? I'll wind up. So against the background of a strident majoritarianism, as well as a defensive retreat and reaction of minority communities, particularly the Muslim community, the music gives a call for transcending the narrowness that competitive communalism invariably induces. And it brings into the politics of protest a fresh view of history and tradition going back several centuries. So the protest music tradition in India, in other words, it has actually become extremely varied once again. So as part of this, questions of nation and tradition have been reinterrogated using musical and literary material from history. And finally, another whole category of music which has found a huge resurgence, and this is true all over the world, and I know it's there to a very great extent in Sri Lanka, is the Western idiom. And what I'm referring to in the Indian context is Indo-Western music. So there's been a proliferation of bands and individuals that have used Western forms of songwriting. There are plenty of rap musicians. There are and from different kinds of political traditions. So there is the whole Dalit rap tradition, which is extremely powerful. You have groups called the Casteless Collective in Tamil Nadu. A musician called Arivu, some of you might be familiar with his music, who actually again, really come up with extremely provocative music. It's also music that works with the Tamil diaspora to create extremely provocative forms. So that it's there in Tamil, it's there in Malayalam, it's there in Marathi. So there are a large number of these young people who are working very interestingly with Western formats and calling them Indian music. In fact, Arivu calls rap music Indian music. And in the northeastern states of India, there are very interesting experiments that are taking place with regard to working with traditional tunes and blending it, with Christian religious traditions and also, Western popular forms. So I'll stop here. So this is just a taste of some of the stuff that is happening, and I want to end by saying that again, I think music offers a very interesting lens through which one can actually understand social history, and the way in which music composition happens, the discussions that happen among musicians, the choice of instruments, the conversations that happen between the instruments become very valuable sites in which one can understand politics. And this is what my work has been about for the last 15 years, and about music as politics. And a lot of musicians don't like it. They don't like this idea when I say that music is politics. And yes. Okay, so you heard some of it in the film. I'll sing that song, Jaane Wale Sipahi Se Poocho. I'll just do a quick pull out a quick translation. Ask the departing soldier, where is he headed, where is he going? Who is that woman who cries, soothing her hungry children? Can you hear life cry out amidst the stench of burnt bodies? The views around are grim, even stars are afraid to twinkle. Has youth been murdered forever? The edges of our garments are blood-stained. As dusk descends and dawn approaches, those who leave the country behind wait for the revolutionary dawn. जाने वाले सिपाही से पूछो वो कहाँ जा रहा है। जाने वाले सिपाही से पूछो वो कहाँ जा रहा है। कौन दुखिया है जो गा रही है, भूखे बच्चों को बहला रही है। लाश जलने की बू आ रही है, जिंदगी है कि चिल्ला रही है। जाने वाले सिपाही से पूछो वो कहाँ जा रहा है। कैसे सहमे हुए हैं नजारे, कैसे डर डर के जलते हैं तारे। क्या जवानी का खून हो रहा है, सुर्ख है आंचलों के किनारे। जाने वाले सिपाही से पूछो वो कहाँ जा रहा है। गिर रहा है सियाही का डेरा, हो रहा है मेरी जान सवेरा। ऐ वतन छोड़ कर जाने वाले, खुल गया इनकलाबी फरेरा। जाने वाले सिपाही से पूछो वो कहाँ जा रहा है। जाने वाले सिपाही से पूछो वो कहाँ जा रहा है।